Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes running fast if you're the car chick. Now, here she is.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the first Straight Shift podcast of 2022. Happy New Year. Those of you who have been listening for a while may remember that back in November of 2019, I did a podcast on the impact or potential impact of electric vehicles on the U.S. economy, how they might impact oil prices, how they would change how we pay taxes to support our roads, what the impact to jobs in the automotive industry might be. Granted, this was all before the pandemic hit and everything, kind of went to hell in a handbasket, but most of that information still very much holds true. So you may want to go back and listen to that one if you haven't already. I believe it was episode 48. But let's fast forward 2 years, and a lot has changed, and there are so many new, what I'm going to call electrified vehicles on the market. That's hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and full electric vehicles. And the marketing hype about these new makes and models that are coming out, combined with rising gas prices across the country, especially in places like the Northeast and California, all of this is sparking new consumer interest in this new technology. And I'm personally getting a lot more questions from people who are potentially interested in an electric car. They want to learn more about it. They are thinking about buying one. Is it right for them? Part of that is because I have a rapidly expanding client base in California and the Northeast where these technologies are more popular anyway, but I'm even seeing an increased interest from clients in the Carolinas and Texas, all over the country. So figured it was about time to do a podcast to go into the detail about this new technology, these electrified cars. But of course, when I was putting together the outline for this and doing the research, I ended up going down this rabbit hole of massive amounts of information because this really is a whole nother animal. And there is so much to know about these vehicles and how they work. And, I ended up dusting off, my high school physics notebook and remembering all of the basic technology about how electricity works. So I'm going to end up splitting this into probably a 3-podcast series on the electric vehicles. So today we're going to talk about the technologies themselves, how they work, how are they different, so that you can understand the difference between these different types of vehicles and how they differ from what I'm going to call traditional cars powered by gasoline, internal combustion engines. We really need a whole new vocabulary to talk about electrified vehicles. So we're going to get a little bit nerdy today, but I promise to keep it as much in layman's terms as possible. And the good news is unlike high school physics, there will not be a test at the end of this podcast. So if it takes a little time to absorb this information, don't worry about it. You're not the only one. Then the following podcast is going to get into the realities of owning an electric vehicle. What are the considerations? What are the costs? What are the maintenance associated with electric vehicles? We're going to get into all that. And then I will do a dedicated podcast to talk about all the different makes and models of these plug-in hybrid and electric vehicles that are either already out on the market today or are coming out, assuming that we can get enough computer chips to actually build them. So without further ado, let's get into talking about electric and electrified vehicle technology. The different types that we're going to talk about today are the hybrids, the plug-in hybrids, and pure electric vehicles, or EVs. And I'm going to do it in reverse order because I think fully electric vehicles, at least in concept, are the easiest to understand. An electric vehicle is powered by an electric motor. Surprise, surprise. But versus an internal combustion engine that most of our cars run on today. And that means they get their power from a battery instead of gasoline. And those batteries are rechargeable lithium-ion batteries, very similar to what is in your cell phone, just bigger and a lot more expensive. Obviously, the most well-known examples of electric vehicles today are the Teslas. But those were not the first vehicles to hit the U.S. market. The very first electric car in the U.S. was actually developed all the way back in 1890 by a gentleman by the name of William Morrison in Des Moines, Iowa, of all places. And his electric vehicle was basically a 6-passenger carriage, like a true horseless carriage that was capable of reaching a whopping 14 miles an hour. So, needless to say, the technology has come a little ways since then, and the rapid development of this technology over the past 20-ish years is a lot in part due to Tesla openly sharing their research and their intellectual property with the rest of the automotive industry, as opposed to hoarding all their secrets like most businesses do to gain a competitive advantage. They really wanted everyone to be working on this technology so that it could get better so much faster than if everyone tried to develop it independently. So Tesla, thank you very much for playing nicely and sharing your toys with the other kids in the sandbox. Mother Earth is very grateful. So let's talk about the technology that underpins these electric vehicles and how they differ from the gas-powered vehicles that most of us have grown up with. And to do that, we need to learn a completely new vocabulary. Most of us have grown up with terms like displacement, which is, how big is the engine? Is it a 5.0 liter? Is it a 3.2 liter? What is it? Horsepower, miles per gallon, or for those of you outside the United States and Britain, liters per kilometer. But those terms all mean pretty much squat when you're talking about electric vehicles. So here's where we get to learn some new words. And we're going to start with a review of some of the basic concepts from high school physics. And if you're like me, it's been a while since high school physics, but the things that I remember most about high school physics are my teacher, Mr. Bromley. He was really cool. He was also the football coach, and he liked a more hands-on approach to teaching physics. So, we did the traditional egg drop challenge, but the thing that was most fun for me, and this has nothing to do with electric cars, I'm just sharing a warm memory from my past, but I was a figure skater growing up, and we had a field across the street from the high school that was a public park that they flooded every winter and froze, and it was a public outdoor ice skating rink, and I taught the lessons there. So when we were doing the physics chapter on centripetal and centrifugal force, Mr. Bromley thought, what a great way to teach it since we have a figure skater in the class. So we all got bundled up. It was the last class of the day and went across the street. And he taught those concepts by having me do various types of spins on my ice skates out on the ice and demonstrate how I sped up when I pulled my arms in and changed position. And so we had a really good time, and that was a lot of fun. But electricity was kind of a different ballgame. So remembering back to those concepts, the first term we need to remember is electric tension. This is what's known as voltage. That's what's measured in volts. The other one we need to know is electric current, and that refers to the flow of those electrons through some sort of conductor, and that is what is measured in amps. Power, which we all love, power, equivalent to the voltage multiplied by the current. And that is what is measured in watts or kilowatts. And kilowatts is a key term for these electric cars, as is the measurement for energy. Energy is the power multiplied by time in hours. And this is where we get the term kilowatt hours. So those are the most important terms that we need to understand, because those are the units of measurement when it comes to electric vehicles. So we need to understand what those really mean and what the difference is. So my favorite analogy for this, I think it makes the most sense to most people. Kilowatts indicates the capacity to transfer energy, and kilowatts per hour is the amount of energy that is effectively transferred in that time. So let's think about water and water flowing through pipes. The bigger the pipe, the more water can flow through it, right? So the energy refers to the amount of water that is flowing through the pipe for a given period of time. So instead of water flowing through a pipe, you have electrons flowing through a conductor. But water pipes is a much easier concept to understand. So let's remember that it's kilowatts and kilowatts per hour. Unlike internal combustion engines, electric motors are actually very, very simple. So we don't have to worry about things like displacement, how many cylinders does it have? So the concepts of a 4-cylinder, a 6-cylinder, a meaty V8, throw those out the window. They don't mean squat when it comes to electric cars. You don't have valves. You don't have turbochargers. You don't even, in most cases, have a normal transmission, with the exception of some vehicles. Just all that technology works very differently. But what's important for you as a consumer to understand is that the output of an electric motor is measured in kilowatts. Now, the companies that are making these cars, because we have been thinking in terms of horsepower for over a century now, they want to make sure that they can relate the electric motor's output capabilities to something that we understand. So they will still translate it into a horsepower number that makes more sense to us as consumers. And fortunately, there is math that will do that. Horsepower equals your kilowatts times 1.369. I have no idea where they got that fraction, but that is the math that is involved. So, for example, a 100 kilowatt motor produces effectively 136 horsepower. So, fortunately, we can convert them to terms that we're more familiar with. So, let me just give you some examples of the cars out there. The Nissan Leaf, that has, 110 kilowatt electric motor. So that translates to about 147 horsepower. Nothing terribly spectacular, but it's a pretty small car. Now, if you want something a little more exciting, your average Tesla Model S, at least their base model, I'm sorry, not the Model S, the Model 3, which has become very, very popular. It's their most, quote, affordable Tesla. That has a 211 kilowatt motor. And that translates to about 283 horsepower, more or less. So that sounds a little bit more fun. Now, Porsche, because, the Germans fully believe that anything worth doing is worth overdoing, their Taycan Turbo, which is Porsche's new electric sedan, which is ridiculous, has an electric motor. And this is the Turbo S version without the overboost. So that's getting a little complicated, but effectively their base model car, so to speak, has a 460 kilowatt electric motor. It translates to over 600 horsepower, and that's without the overboost. With their boost technology, which I will not get into, it's like 750 horsepower. With the launch control technology they have in it, it can go from 0 to 60 in about 2.5 seconds. That is the same acceleration of most F1 race cars. It's absolutely ridiculous. The concept of torque, which I always translate to how much oomph does the car have, that still means something with electric motors. And that's the beauty of electric motors. When you lay on that electric power, so to speak, those electrons just flow and you get this, what's called a flat torque curve. It accelerates very linearly and very awesomely in most cases. So for those of us that are nerds about, race cars, we love torque, and the flat torque curve of an electric motor is seriously, seriously fun in real life. So I will get down off of my race car nerdy platform for a second, and let's talk about fuel economy. Again, we have to learn to use some different terminologies. Fuel consumption of a gas-powered car, right? That's measured in miles per gallon. We know this in the U.S., measured in kilometers per liter everywhere else in the world. But because there are no actual gallons in the electric world, the term fuel economy, you have to start thinking about fuel in terms of electricity, the electrons. It's really measured in kilowatt hours, which translates into a range for practicality's sake. How many miles can the car go before it runs out of electricity and leaves you stranded? These are the important real life applications, people. So different electric vehicles have different kilowatt hours in terms of their battery capacity and therefore have different ranges. On the low end, most pure electric cars, have a range of 100 miles, which is not particularly far and practical, up to 400 or more miles on the high end. Tesla is one of the most efficient, if you want to call it that, of the electric vehicles. They have some of the longest ranges, and that depends on several things. The range is determined by the capacity of the battery, the kilowatt hours that it can hold. How many electrons can it hold? But it also depends on some other things, because it's not just the electric motor that is eating up those electrons. In real life, you are probably listening to some music on your radio or your satellite radio. You may be running the heat or the air conditioning. You might be using a navigation system. The vehicle is communicating to you on the fancy screens. So there are other things in the vehicle other than just the motor that is moving your car that are consuming that electricity. So the more of those other things, those accessories you use, especially things like the air conditioner, that is going to suck the electrons out of your battery a lot faster, thus reducing that range. So when you see a range number published by a manufacturer, it usually says up to however many miles, knowing that in real life, it's not going to be that far. So don't expect to actually get to go 400 miles before you run out of electricity. It might actually be 300 miles because you're running the radio and the air conditioner, etc. So this is one of those things where we have to, on paper is one thing, and in actual real life is something totally different. But as I said, this range is determined by how much energy the batteries can store, and that capacity is what is expressed in kilowatt hours. The more kilowatt hours, the higher that number, the longer the battery will operate, and thus longer the range. Mostly. So for example, the Nissan Leaf the SV model has a 40 kilowatt hour battery, and you can go up to about 150 miles on that. Now, if you ever watched the old Top Gear episode where Jeremy Clarkson actually tested that in real life, they found with running the radio, running the electricity, or even just the blower fan, that was reduced significantly. And I think they actually got a realistic range of like 35 miles or something stupid. Granted, that was an old version, the original Nissan Leaf, and the technology has improved. They've gotten more efficient, but it was a pretty funny episode. On the flip side, you look at Teslas, and they're very, very efficient. And so the Model 3 standard, they have different trim levels that give you different battery capacities, but their small one has a 60 kilowatt hour battery, and it gets you about 272 miles, assuming you don't use too many of the accessories. And that's pretty impressive. Now, the Porsche, because, I can't talk about these without talking about the Taycan Turbo. It's just ridiculous. The base model of that has about a 93 kilowatt battery. And that's bigger, right? So you would expect it to have a longer range. But its range is really only about 200 miles. That's less than the Tesla, which has a smaller battery. So why is that? Well, again, remember how much horsepower this car can put out? So the battery may be able to store a lot of energy, but that car uses that energy a lot faster to go faster. So in this case, the size of the battery, the capacity of the battery doesn't necessarily translate into a longer range, but you're going to have way more fun in the range that it does go. So I hope that explains a little bit about the terminology and how you now have to think about electric vehicles. Instead of horsepower and miles per gallon, now we are talking about battery capacities and electric ranges, how far you can go on a charge. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to talk about the different types of the technologies. We're going to talk about the plug-in hybrid versus the hybrid and how those are different, and see if we can't make a little bit of sense out of those. Be right back after this. you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a great price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 704-248-8706. That's 704-248-8706. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
Where the rubber meets the road.
Nice to meet you. Love your asphalt.
Hey, nice treads.
It's Straight Shift with the Car Chick.
Welcome back to the Straight Shift. We are talking about the different technologies behind electrified cars, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and electric vehicles. And I hope the first half of this podcast that really got into the physics and all the terminology on electric cars made sense to those of you that do not have a physics degree. So we're going to get a little bit simpler now, but talk about the plug-in hybrids and how those kind of split the difference between an electric vehicle and a hybrid vehicle. So a plug-in hybrid, or what you may see a PHEV, that's the acronym that's used, a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. These get a little more confusing. Both hybrid and plug-in hybrid vehicles, unlike an electric vehicle, which only has an electric motor, hybrids and plug-in hybrids, as the hybrid name would suggest, have both. They have an electric motor and a regular gas-powered internal combustion engine, which I'm just going to call a gas engine for simplicity. The first plug-in hybrid was sold in the US back in 2010, if you remember, the Chevy Volt. So it's pretty cool that a US manufacturer was the first to bring this technology to market. A plug-in hybrid, as the name clearly says, you plug it in just like a regular electric vehicle to charge that battery. Rocket science, right, folks? I told you I was going to try and keep this simple. Now, with a plug-in hybrid, the electric motor has the ability to power the car on its own, but for a much shorter range because it's a lot smaller and it has a much smaller capacity battery. So you may be able to go 20 miles or 30 miles, maybe 40 miles, depending on which model you choose and the type of battery that it has, but you can only get that far. But the difference is, with an pure electric vehicle, that battery is all you've got. So once you run out of electricity, you're done. You're stranded. With the plug-in hybrid, once that little battery runs out of electricity, the electric motor goes, I'm done. And then the gas motor, it passes the baton like a relay race, and that gas engine takes over, and now you're just running on a normal gasoline engine. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds, so you don't get stranded when you run out of that electricity. It gives you a nice big safety net. So how do you recharge one of these cars, either a plug-in hybrid or a pure EV? We can't talk about the technologies without talking about how to recharge them, because that's a real life concern that we have to address. And of course, it's simple and complicated at the same time. There are currently 3 different types or levels of charging on the market. Level 1 is the basic plug it into the wall in a regular 120 volt household power outlet, charging it almost just like your cell phone does. And you can typically get anywhere, around 1 to 1.4 kilowatts of power out of those. So real life translations, to fully charge that little Nissan Leaf that only has that relatively small 40 kilowatt hour battery takes about 35 hours. So this is not a very efficient. It's like a slow trickle to resupply those electrons to the battery. So it's not a practical charging solution for most people. But of course, that's the one that comes free with the car. So it is the cheapest solution. And it may work for somebody that has another car as a backup, or they don't drive very often. And so bringing their car home and plugging it back in for a day and a half isn't a big deal. But it's really not the best way to do it. So there is a level 2 charger. And these are both done using alternating current. So level 2 requires a dedicated 240 volt outlet. That's what your washer and dryer, your dryer plugs into. So most people have 240 in their home. They just may not have it in the garage. I happen to have one in my garage because the former owner was a woodworker and he had a whole bunch of apparently really cool tools, way cooler than what I have. And he required 240. So I've got 240 in my garage. So that's nice. I don't have an electric car to plug into it, but if I ever get one, I'll be good to go. Now, depending on your setup and the capacity of the charger, you can get as much as like 9.6 kilowatts of power. So translating that into real world, instead of taking 35 hours to charge your Nissan Leaf, you can do it in 8 hours. So basically you can charge your car overnight, very much like people get in the habit of doing with their cell phones. This is the daily charging solution that most of the car manufacturers will recommend to you for your electric car. It's not just because they want to sell you the nicer charger. It actually is better for the battery, it's better for the car, and it's more practical for your lifestyle. Of course, you can buy these from the dealer, but most of them are made by third-party companies, and the good ones can be purchased on Amazon, and they typically, around $500 to $1,000. But then remember, there is the installation charge. So you do have to have a licensed electrician in most cases install one of these, especially if you've got to have them run a 240 outlet to your garage. And the installation costs, depending on whether you've already got that kind of power running to your garage or not, can range from, $750 up to $1,500 or more dollars, depending on where you live. So you have to consider that cost on top of the cost of the electric car itself. But definitely have it done by a licensed professional. Most building codes required by law, because you don't want to be messing with electricity yourself when you're not a licensed electrician and potentially burn down your house. But the level 2 is definitely worth the investment for people just to have a more practical charge your car overnight lifestyle. There is a level 3. And this is also called fast charging, but this is done via direct current, not alternating current. And I am not going to go back to that chapter in high school physics. Just if you don't remember the difference between the two, just Google that. But these are done via special charging stations that are 400 volts. And depending on the type of station and the capacity of your vehicle, you may get as much as 50 kilowatts of power with those types of chargers. Tesla makes one called Tesla Superchargers, because of course they're going to lead the market on this. And there's 150 kilowatts out of those babies. That's pretty impressive. But this type of charging, the fast charging, really takes its toll on the batteries. And so you really don't want this to be your primary charging solution or do it on a daily basis. So the manufacturers will talk about, and in the owner's manual of these cars, they're going to talk about charging the battery to 80%, not charging it all the way on this technology. This is hey, you're out, you're driving around in your electric vehicle, you do more driving than you think, or it's hot and you've got the AC running, and so you run out of electricity a little bit faster. Now you can go to one of these fast charging stations and charge it up enough to get home or to finish your errands or whatever it is you're doing, and get back home and then do a full charge on your level 2 station at home. But this fast charge, you can get 80% charge usually in under an hour. So this is why these are the types of charging stations that you will typically find in public places. So Whole Foods was one of the first businesses, because of their whole business philosophy, to offer charging stations for electric cars in their parking lot. Like the best parking spaces right up front, reserved for electric cars. It's pretty cool. These are the ones that are being added to a lot of gas stations, because eventually gas stations are going to go by the wayside and it's going to be more of fast charging stations, rest stops, many parking decks at uptown in your big cities. Employers, corporate campuses are providing these types of stations to charge your car quickly while you're there. They may have a level 2 station that you can just charge your car for the 8 hours that you're at work if you need to. The infrastructure bill that passed Congress back in the fall had a big provision for rolling out more and more of these types of charging stations with level 2s and level 3s across the country. And think about what this is going to do, because the biggest limit of electric cars is that range. It's great if you run around in the city, if you have a reasonable commute. People like me who don't drive very much. I go to my mom's house, I go to the grocery store, I go to Lowe's and Home Depot. I go to a networking event every now and then, but I don't put a lot of miles on my car, nor do I drive long distances in one trip typically. So now you're going to be able to, now you can road trip, to that football game that's, 5 or 6 hours away. You could take your electric car to the mountains, to the beach. It's just going to open up the opportunity to take your electric car on that road trip. And that makes it a much more usable vehicle for most people in the United States, because our country is huge. It's easy to have electric vehicles in European countries that are relatively small or in very dense urban areas. But to explore the United States, or even just to go over the river and through the woods to grandmother's house for the holidays, it usually involves a road trip for us Americans. So by them rolling out this new infrastructure, and Tesla has been funding and implementing a lot of this to date. So if you look at some electric infrastructure maps, and Tesla's website has a link to that. You can also just Google, electric charging station map USA, and it will show you. And just looking at the difference between what that map looked like 2 years ago and what it looks like today, it's incredible. We are really starting to make electrified cars a more practical reality for the United States of America. And that's really exciting. Now, granted, they're still expensive, but the cost to own is what we'll cover in the next podcast, and is a whole different story. But it's really cool that you can stop at some rest stops in this country, have lunch, go to the bathroom, recharge your car a little bit, and then take the next leg of your road trip. But in talking about these different levels of charging, of course, the connectors are not universal. So let's think back to our cell phones, right? You bought a cell phone from a certain company, and the charger and the cable and the type of connector only worked for that type of phone. It was so freaking frustrating. There now are more standards, so most of your Android phones today have a USB-C connector, but then there's Apple, which has the Lightning connector. Guess what, folks? It's the same with electric cars. You have the North American standard, you have a kind of Japanese/Asian standard that the Japanese and Korean cars have. There's more of a European standard. And then, of course, Tesla is the Apple of the car companies. And of course, they have their own completely proprietary, unique type of connector. So you may need an adapter. It's it's just a really expensive cell phone, people. So these are the types of things that you have to understand. What type of connector does your car come with? And then will it plug into the charging station at the Whole Foods, or do you need to buy some sort of adapter? It's just a lot of fun. So those are some of the things that we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about the realities of owning one of these cars. But I wanted to talk about just the regular hybrid technology, because these are the type of cars we've lived with the longest and people are most familiar with because they've been on the market. The Toyota Prius was launched in Japan back in 1997, followed quickly by the Honda Insight. And then by 2000, those cars were in the North American market. So we've lived for 2 decades with the Prius and other types of hybrid vehicles. And a regular hybrid, so let's think about the Prius. I know I don't like to think about the Prius, but it really is kind of the gold standard for hybrid vehicles and what most people know. But it's got an electric motor and a gasoline engine. And in a regular hybrid vehicle, those two motors work either independently or simultaneously, and this is where it gets a little complicated, to power the car. And you don't have to plug it in to recharge the battery because the battery is smart enough to charge itself. They use regenerative power. So when you're braking or decelerating, basically they're recycling power that results from those actions to go back into charging the electric motor battery. So it's great. You do not have to plug the thing in. It's smart enough to recharge itself as you drive it, but it does work on a different type of battery. Most hybrid cars run on a nickel metal hydride battery, not the lithium ion batteries, although we're starting to see a little bit of change in that technology, and they're looking at, okay, how do we make lithium ion batteries work better in hybrid cars? But while the advantage of the nickel metal hydride batteries, they're much more reliable. They work better in colder climates, but the process to manufacture them is pretty hideous for the environment. So they're working on shifting some of that technology. So that's something that we're just going to keep our eye on. But that's really not as important to actually owning the car. But where we start to get a little bit confused about hybrid cars, there's not just one type of hybrid car technology. They're not all made the same. There's actually a few different types of regular hybrids. You don't have to plug in hybrid. The first one is called a mild hybrid. It's not like mild, medium, and spicy, but mild hybrid, I don't even consider these to be true hybrid vehicles, and they're not marketed really as hybrids. They're just regular cars, but they use some of the elements of that hybrid technology to be a little bit more fuel efficient. Essentially, a mild hybrid adds a little bitty capacity battery to the conventional starter motor and the alternator system that allows the vehicle to potentially shut down the internal combustion engine for short periods of time, like when you're at traffic lights or you're coasting downhill. But it's still providing power to your accessories, your radio, your air conditioner, your lights, etc. So that little tiny battery is recharged like regular hybrid batteries using that regenerative power. Sometimes the electric motor can even provide a little bit of assistance to the regular engine during accelerating, but it's really a very incremental increase in your fuel efficiency. Really, it's the start-stop technology that is most common with these, quote, mild hybrids. And that annoys the crap out of a lot of drivers. Like, I could never drive a vehicle that has that start-stop because there's that hesitation when it has to restart. And I do not hesitate when I go. When the light turns green, I'm going. Granted, I am not the most fuel-efficient driver, but it annoys a lot of people. But it does give you a little bit better fuel economy on those vehicles. So for examples of your mild hybrids, the Mazda CX-5 has this technology. Some of your German cars like the Audi A4 and then the BMW 3 Series have it. Even the Kia Sportage takes advantage of it. So there are vehicles using this mild hybrid technology, but they're not going to be called hybrid vehicles. They're not going to be marketed as such, and they will not be under the hybrid tab on the manufacturer's website. They're just regular cars that are cheating and using a little bit of that technology to try and eke out 1 more mile per gallon in your fuel economy. Getting into real hybrids, there are 2 essential different styles of hybrids, a series hybrid and a parallel hybrid. A series hybrid, the petrol engine, your gas-powered engine, and the electric motor, they work in series. This is kind of like the Christmas lights that are either series or parallel, meaning that if one light goes out, the whole line goes out, or if one goes out, the whole light still stays lit up. That's how I think about series and parallel with electricity. But in terms of the hybrid, it just talks about how the 2 different motors work together to propel the vehicle. And the series hybrids are typically considered what they call extended range vehicles. And they're essentially fully electric cars that have a smaller petrol engine that acts as an onboard generator to recharge the battery pack and provide that additional range. These vehicles are not very common, and it's not a technology that I really expect to see expanded. But one of the examples, BMW has one of their i3 models, the i3 REX, which stands for extended range. That vehicle does it that way, but it's just not as common. When you think of a hybrid vehicle, you're really thinking a little bit more about parallel, or the most common is series parallel, right? Because why not make it even more complicated? But just a plain parallel hybrid, this is literally the gas engine and the electric motor, they work together and provide that torque to a single input, which in most cases is directly into your gearbox. And vehicles, Honda is the one that uses this technology the most. So they found it on the Accord, like the Civic hybrids, the Honda Insight. They use more of this parallel technology. So for those of you who really understand how engines, transmissions, clutches all work together, and I could do a whole podcast on that, but honestly, it's better to see it visually. So go to YouTube, and there's some great videos out there that have diagrams actually show you how it works. But with a parallel hybrid, when the electric motor only is being used, the clutch connection to the engine is open. But then when it's in combustion mode, they both work together to run the vehicle at the same speed. I'm not going to get into the details. It's very complicated, but just keep in mind that that's the technology that Honda uses. Most other manufacturers, Toyota, Mazda, Hyundai, Kia, they use the series parallel hybrid. It's called a series parallel system. It's also sometimes referred to as a power split hybrid. And again, a lot of these are marketing terms that can be trademarked, so that's why they call them different things, just to confuse us, because they can trademark them. But in this case, they use a series of clutches or a planetary gear set to the gearbox to translate the power from both the electric and the gas motor to the gearbox to power the car. In reality, what's important to understand about this is that this system is a smoother transition with the two motors, so it's going to accelerate more smoothly, it's going to run more smoothly, and it's going to give you a more linear power delivery. Personally, I think it's a better technology, and it's very efficient. You get a very lean burning petrol engine, so you have very few emissions, but it is typically less responsive at your lower revs. So this is why the Prius is not going to win any races off the line. It takes a little bit to get going. That's the torque. They don't have a lot of torque unless they implement a separate torque converter, or if they use more of the torque from the electric motor. But overall, most people that are looking at hybrid cars, what they care about is the fuel economy. These are typically not drivers who are doing jackrabbit starts when the light turns green. They're not acceleration junkies like I am, so it doesn't really matter that the car doesn't have a whole lot of torque because it gets a ridiculous number of miles to the gallon, and that is what most people care about. So Toyota calls their series parallel hybrid system their hybrid synergy drive, because that's just the word synergy. Anytime the automotive makers can use the term synergy, it sounds really cool. So that's what they use. That's your Prius, that's your Camry hybrid, that's your Corolla hybrid, all your Lexus hybrids. Hyundai also uses it, so that's what you're going to see in the new Tucson hybrid, the Ioniq, all the new hybrids that Hyundai's coming out with, which are pretty exciting, which we'll talk about in a later podcast. But is one really better than the other? Well, yes and no. They have the series technology versus the parallel or series parallel technology. They both save you on gas. And like I said, that's the whole point. Save gas, save money, save the environment. But they each work a little bit better under different circumstances. So the Hybrid Center, which is an independent organization that researches and tests hybrid technologies, the combination of series and parallel, so the series parallel technology that Toyota uses, they are more efficient at driving on the highway, driving at highway speeds, driving at those constant speeds. That's why you'll see the Prius gets ridiculously good gas mileage, both in the city and on the highway. Series hybrids, like the Hondas, are more efficient for driving in the city. So you may see a larger split in the fuel economy ratings between city and highway. Those hybrids are going to have a higher number typically for their city fuel economy versus what they get on the highway. So that can sometimes give you an indication of the type of hybrid technology that's in use by looking at those fuel economy numbers, but it's not a guarantee. But that's really the real world difference between the two technologies, and one just being better than the other. But the fuel economy of a hybrid vehicle is not just about the hybrid technology used to power it. Lots of other factors come into play, not the least of which is aerodynamics, the weight of the vehicle, and even the type of tires. Hybrid vehicles typically have what's called low rolling resistance tires. And again, I'm not going to get into how those work. That could be a whole other podcast on tires, which I might have to do. But they reduce the friction between the car and the road. Less friction, you're going to have better fuel economy. So that's why a Prius can get almost 60 miles to the gallon. It's reasonably light. It has low rolling resistance tires, and it's shaped like a football. So this is why a large SUV, in contrast, even when it's a hybrid, if you think back 2009, the Tahoe came in a hybrid, and it still got crap gas mileage because it's a giant rolling brick. So think about Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers throwing a football versus throwing a brick. That pretty much tells you why the Prius is a more efficient vehicle than an SUV, even in hybrid form. So I know I got really, really nerdy and technical in trying to explain these technologies without having any visuals and without doing math, but I hope it has helped you to understand at least the difference between pure electric, plug-in hybrid, and regular hybrid vehicles. So understanding the differences in those technologies and how they work is now going to set us up for the next podcast, where we talk about the real world considerations of owning these vehicles and maintaining them, and what do you need to think about, what do you need to be worried about, what don't you need to be worried about if you're considering owning one of these. So lots of exciting new models coming out, and we'll talk about those in a later podcast as well. But until then, no matter what type of vehicle you drive, I hope you drive it safely. I'm out of here.
The Straight Shift podcast is copyright LeeAnn Shattuck, the Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of LeeAnn Shattuck or the Car Chick.